Hey, Courtney.
Hey, Dan.
How's today going so far?
It's going. It is a busy Wednesday. How's yours?
That feels accurate to my experience. Yeah, I rarely find myself bored, so uh, similar experience so far. Similar.
Any difficult conversations today, Dan, that you care to share with us as people are joining us?
The challenge or the benefit of the difficult conversations thing is, yeah, I have examples we could talk through. So we'll see what we get into, but yeah, it'll be fun to visit about those here soon. So
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Well, hey, thanks so much to all of you who are joining us for this fun conversation or difficult
uh-huh,
conversations
uh-huh.
fun, but joining us for this fun conversation. We are so excited to talk with you today as you are gearing up for 5 steps to mastering difficult conversations. We have 2 asks for you. One is to make sure that your chat is toggled on to everyone so that we all have the privilege of seeing your thoughts or questions. And then also, as you're, again, gearing up, getting ready, drop on a scale of 1 to 5, drop a number in the chat that tells us how much you look forward to having difficult conversations. 1 is, I dread them, I avoid them. In fact, I try to never have them. And 5 is, this makes me so excited. It's why I come to work. I seek out difficult conversations. So drop that in the chat. I see some 3s. That's not bad. Kristen
Nice.
says 2. No, thank you. No, ma'am.
Uh,
The more
I'm
threes, the more.
curious, Courtney, how many people were like, "Hey, we're going to talk about having difficult conversations," and before they even joined the webinar, they started like panicking a little bit. They're like, "Uh-oh, I'm not going to have it, but I'm actually anticipating that it's going to be a challenge, and so my body is reacting that it's going to be hard."
Oh, that's so good. I identify with that, Dan. I am having a adverse physical somatic reaction to talking about difficult conversation. So if that is you, I am in that camp. Hey, again, for those of you that are just jumping on, welcome. We're so excited to talk about difficult conversations with you today. You'll notice there's some numbers in the chat. And what we asked was, hey, scale of 1 to 5, how much do you look forward to having difficult conversations? We know there are some of you that it excites you. The challenge, the opposition, the conversation is exciting to you, and some of you absolutely dread them. So we'd love to hear where you fall on that 1 to 5 scale. I like the
Courtney?
conversation happening, Dan, around positive reinforcement. Do you see that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, Alicia, brilliant. She's like, "Hey, listen, if I'm going to have a difficult conversation, I'm getting iced coffee because I'm worth it. Okay, and I'm going to treat myself for how
Exactly.
challenging it was." Courtney, I'm curious for you. Scale of
Yeah.
1 to 5. When you think about having difficult conversations, is it something you avoid at all costs, or is it something that you've learned to look forward to?
Yeah, it's a great question. I probably fall in that 3 camp because
Mm,
I feel like, as we'll talk about today, I've got a pretty good perspective on why they matter and should we have them and how we should have them. So I see the
sure.
value, but my Enneagram 9 people pleaser tendencies tend to supersede some of that sometimes and make me dread them a little more than I'd like. How about you?
I uh, I don't like to create conflict, but I do like to resolve it. And so I would probably lean more towards like the 4 end of the spectrum, because I'd rather just have the conversation, get into whatever we need to talk through, and engage. Like, cool. Well, how do we move forward together? But just because I don't run away from them as much or steer clear of them, it doesn't mean that I haven't always been great at them. There's a lot of mistakes I've learned in that, and a lot of things I wish I could go back and redo.
Yeah, I get that completely. Go back and
Yeah.
redo. I think we all probably can identify with that statement. Well, hey, we will get ready to jump into the 5 steps, as I'm sure you're all quite eager to hear. We're so glad that you joined us. Final reminders here as we're kicking off. Make sure that your chat is toggled to everyone instead of hosts and panelists, so that everyone that's attending today can see your questions or your comments or your thoughts. We all want to share those together. And then as we're going, if any questions pop up, you can drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we've set some time aside for the end for us to address those. But hi, welcome to 5 Steps to Mastering Difficult Conversations. My name is Courtney Balbin, and I am the Manager of Customer Outcomes here at Leadr, and I am joined by our Manager of Customer Growth, Dan Cogswell. We are so excited about this first installment in a new webinar series all around training and equipping managers. Our mission here at Leadr is to make managers better leaders. And part of that is just practical training and conversations around what effective leaders do. How do they act? How do we all know how to do this? And the secret is that we don't, and we're all learning as we go. And so we hope that today's conversation helps move you a little bit closer to feeling confident as a leader and a coach. So again, 5 steps to mastering difficult conversations that, Dan and I have one real goal or hope from today's webinar, and that is that you hear something or learn something that you hadn't considered before, and that leads you to one small actionable step you can take this week. And so as you go, my encouragement is to be looking for that step. What is going to be the one small step you take that makes you more effective at having these difficult, tricky conversations? Navigating tumultuous coaching manager waters is part of what it means to lead well. That's the reality. And we want you to leave this webinar with one more tool, just one. Even though we're giving you 5 steps, we want you to leave with one more tool in your toolbox for those moments. So Dan and I are going to walk you through the 5 steps, but we're also going to give you a little peek into how Leadr could help support you as you attempt to execute these steps and maybe equip you more effectively than you've been equipped in the past. And so Dan, before we jump into those steps and tips, I think it's helpful to answer one simple question. And the question is, why do we have to do this in the first place? Do we have to? Tell me more.
Yeah, great question. Great question to get us kicked off. A couple things I'll share with you. One is this. It's a quote from a book that our co-founders just finished up writing. It's actually going to be coming out soon. It's called Management is Dead. But let me read this quote to you. It says, challenging conversations don't have to burn bridges. In fact, when done well, these conversations can actually become learning opportunities that build more trust instead of eroding it. Now, that may not have been your experience to this time in your life, or you may have had different experiences in places that you've worked or how you grew up. But we know that when we engage honestly with people, it can actually lead towards more trust, which means that we can move further faster. Here's what else is interesting. So when you look at the current workforce, 90% of millennials want candid, frequent feedback, and then the majority of Gen Y and Gen X as well. What we know is that the workplace has shifted from what it used to be. In addition to that, right now, about 3/4 of the workforce is actually comprised of Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z. So you have these 2 things that we hold. One, challenging conversations, if done well, can actually lead to building trust. And 2, most of the people in the workforce want candid and frequent feedback as they go, not just once a year in a review, hearing about something that happened 11 months ago. Okay, so that's why we're having this conversation. And then also, people, we have conflict because we exist. It's a natural part of what happens. So we need to learn how to engage it. So let's go ahead and get kicked off with the first step here, Courtney.
Yeah, I think that's so encouraging and helpful as leaders, Dan, because I think we go into these feedback or constructive criticism, difficult conversations and assume that the person we're talking to doesn't want it. But the data is telling us a different story.
Right.
And so before I even get into the first tip, I think it's worth saying, hey, people want to hear from you. They want this feedback from you. And so that can even lower some of our anxiety or our hesitation, lack of confidence, when we know that most of the people we're working with are eager to hear the feedback we have for them. So I love that.
Great point.
So in the spirit of building bridges, the first step is really about mindset. It's about making sure that we as leaders and as managers approach these conversations with the proper goal in mind. The goal of coaching constructive, even difficult conversations is always, always the improvement or development of the other person. It's never punishment. And that can be a bit of a reframe for us. The person you're talking to needs to feel that the desired outcome isn't just to criticize what went wrong or fix a mistake, but to help them build healthier workplace patterns that ultimately move their development forward. Dan gives this illustration a lot around putting a problem in the center of the table and how are we evaluating it. And I think it's that idea. It's an us versus the problem approach instead of me versus you, me versus the direct report versus the manager. And It's worth calling out that, this can be a challenging line to walk whenever conversations get a little bit more critical or things like job termination are on the table. So it's worth acknowledging that, yes, that's fine. And development is important and we keep that front of mind, but this is tough. This is a real
Yeah.
skill and muscle memory to build. But, I think the way that you can ensure you have the right mindset is to focus both your preparation as well as the conversation and documentation on behavior and impact rather than personality or intent. So here's an example of what this could look like. It's instead of saying, hey, Dan, your report was late again, you're so unmotivated. Instead, I could say something like, and we know Dan's very unmotivated. So
that one hurt. That one cut deep, Courtney. Yeah. Wow.
But instead of saying that, I could say something like, hey, Dan, I've noticed you haven't been meeting deadlines. And ultimately, this is starting to impact the team's ability to deliver on time. And so you can hear how that first statement specifically addresses the person, not the behavior, while the second one only addresses the concerning behavior, but then also outlines why it matters. And it's because it's impacting those around them. And so the person you're talking to, I think it's important that they feel that the desired outcome isn't just criticism. It's not just telling Dan the report is late, or even that, hey, you're having a hard time missing deadlines. They need to understand that we're trying to move both their developmental needle forward and the organization as a whole, and it's having a greater impact. So practically, what's a way Leadr can help support you in having a better mindset and a goal-oriented improvement mindset when going into these challenging conversations? And the way we can do that is actually an ongoing habit within a one-on-one conversation that makes this habit or this mindset a little bit more natural. So there's a picture here of a real one-on-one that Dan and I have each week, and he does a really great job of mining for conflict. And he does this when he checks in regularly on what we call the elephant in the room. Is there anything that surfaced that we haven't talked about yet, but we really need to? So before it becomes this big, huge problem that now requires a really difficult, maybe even seemingly out of the blue conversation, it's a regular part of our one-on-ones. And so when we do have difficult conversations, and Dan and I have, we now have a healthy history and a solid muscle memory of what it looks like to tackle tough things together, us versus the problem, rather than to attack or be critical. And so, I think that this is all part, again, this is a habit, this is a mindset, this is a framework. And so there's muscle memory here, there's habit building, and doing this consistently in the one-on-one can make those pointed, specific conversations much more maybe palatable is a good word. And so as we're mining for conflict, we're building those muscles. What's the next step?
Yeah, a quick thought on that too is I think the benefit of keeping the proper goal in mind and creating that muscle memory as you're talking about is it actually creates the psychological safety. It literally creates the space to say, oh, it's okay to talk about hard things. It's okay to talk about things that are challenging. Also, stay tuned for the after hours, and then we'll spill the tea about all those conversations. I'm just kidding. But yeah, next step in mastering some difficult conversations is to keep it timely and relevant. So the idea here is not that something happened and you wait weeks and months and maybe even years to actually address the situation, but that you do it early, and then you can also connect it to some challenges that you're seeing or some emerging patterns that are happening. So the idea here is to give the employee, timely and specific feedback that they can actually do something about. So you should definitely avoid absolutes and generalities. My wife is a professional counselor, and here's what I know. What happens when we engage in things and we say you always or you never, we make it really general. The first thing we're thinking about is when I don't or when I do, that one time maybe. So giving someone a specific example that they can actually grapple with and then engaging how we can move forward together is a really, really helpful piece of the information. So let me show you what that might look like in Leadr, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about it. But here I actually have a hidden topic, I have a hidden agenda item, and I may not even say all of these things to you, but what the example is, hey, in the training session this morning, it seemed like you were distracted. You turned your camera on and off a few different times. And instead of how you typically are you're an active listener who's nodding along, who's engaging in the conversation. You seemed really distracted. So in that scenario, this one's fake, not real, but this one, how that might look with Courtney and I is, hey, Courtney, I noticed during our training session this morning that it seemed like maybe you were a bit distracted. I'm curious, was there something going on?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was fine. I thought I was fine, but I had a rough morning at home. But overall, I felt like I was okay.
Okay, rough morning.
Yeah, kids, work, getting out the door in the morning. Is there
Okay.
ever not a rough morning sometimes? Yeah.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay. Well, I noticed some things, and I wanted to address them with you because they were different than how I normally experience you, and so I wanted to make sure that I checked in. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Are you sure everything's all right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I probably could have paid more attention to maybe how my face looked on camera. And I appreciate you checking in, but overall, I think I'm okay.
Okay, great. So, and scene, I guess, I don't know. But in that scenario, I'm leading with curiosity, right? So I'm leading with curiosity. And what I'm noting is that it's a difference in what I've seen before. I didn't talk necessarily about the impact that it has. So something that I might do in that scenario is say, hey, Courtney, as a leader on the team, here's what I noticed. I noticed that one of our newer hires was sharing something and leading, and you seemed really distracted and were even a bit rude in your body language and how you're paying attention to them. And I'm concerned about how your interaction might impact their confidence and ability.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like I said, I was mostly probably just distracted with the way my morning went, and it's the first morning meeting of the day. But yeah, I never want to make her feel lesser or like what she was saying wasn't valuable, because it's actually really great. And so that's helpful to hear. And again, end scene. I think it's
Yeah,
worth noting that could have also gone really negatively, right, Dan?
sure. So let's say it's why not? Let's get into it.
Do
Let's
it.
say it doesn't go well. Okay. Let's say it doesn't go well. So I'll also share how I get into the conversation a little bit differently. But hey, Courtney, I was thinking about our training this morning, and I noticed some things, and I have some feedback to give you. Any idea what that might be?
No, it was just our normal morning training on Mondays. So no, eager to hear it though.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So here's what's interesting. From my perspective, it seemed like maybe you were a bit distracted this morning, and what gave me that clue or why I felt that is you were on and off camera a few different times, and then also when our new hire Danielle was sharing about some of the things that she was learning and seeing, you seemed a little bit. Your body language was not very open, and it was crossed arms and like shaking your head no when she was sharing some things, and I'm not sure how that may have impacted her ability and confidence in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I had a long morning at home, and so
Okay.
I guess I could have been distracted. I work from home, and so sometimes things happen that I have to go on and off camera for, and so this feels a little bit nitpicky. Like suddenly I have to like put on a front because there's new hires in the room. I didn't mean to make her feel that way. That certainly wasn't. It didn't have anything to do with her. But yeah, I was distracted, but again, I'm kind of a whole person, so.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I certainly, there's realities that exist with working from home and remote work, and we definitely want to engage those things. My concern here is that it's different than how I've experienced you before. That it seems like previously you've been able to be really focused and engaged in our team meetings, and that something was different here. And I want to make sure that I highlighted what I observed and the potential impact that it had on our team, and just want to pay attention to if it's something that continues, and also if there's something that we can do to help create a better space for you to show up in a more engaged and helpful way for the rest of the team. Because the reality is you're a leader, and I don't want the team to miss out on all the great things that you have to offer when you show up well. So that's the reason I'm bringing it up.
Thank you, Dan. That was so helpful. No, I love what you did there, Dan, because you didn't let me getting offended or somewhat put off by the fact that you were calling something out derail you from making sure that it was framed, again, like we talked about in step one, toward development and improvement, but then also specifically addressing the impact. So it's like, hey, I hear you, you're a whole person, you're also a part of this team. And so we need to address both of those things at the same time. And you walked that line really well.
Thank you. Yeah, let's move to the next step, huh? Let's see what else we get into. But yeah, just having the reason last thought about it is I love having a topic and just placing things in there either in the moment as I see them so I can address them quickly, or throughout the week that I can talk with them about related to really a good one-on-one, which is caring for them, developing them, and then helping them grow. So anyway, let's move on to the next thing. All right.
All right. Well, I love this one, Dan. I have a counseling background like your wife. And so anytime we can talk about active listening, my ears perk up and I get pretty excited. But, there's so much here with keeping it conversational that changes the way conversations pan out. And, I think that's the key, is that difficult conversations are conversations. We as leaders need to make sure that we are structuring and positioning the conversation and ourselves in a way that allows for two-directional dialogue. You just modeled that really well. Even though the issue that we're talking about may actually be the employee's fault, heaping blame, guilt, or really direct, again, person-oriented criticism with no opportunity for feedback, response, dialogue isn't helpful. I mean, in fact, they might not even recognize the problem, kind of like that role play we just did, to begin with. And so asking how that felt, asking what their experience was, how that lands, again, something you just modeled for us really well, is so important. And it is really important that we are clear and direct around the behavior that we're addressing, but it's also important that we ask questions and give employees chances to perhaps share their perspective on the situation. So remember, it's solution focused, not a problem conversation, right? It's not you versus me, it's us versus the problem. We're moving toward a solution. And so the only way we can do that if it's really us instead of just me. And so there's a couple sample conversation starters or phrases here that actually come from the Management is Dead book that Chris and Matt wrote for us. And I thought they were just golden. Taking the time, like these outlined, to ask employees' perspectives on situations really allows them to, number one, get ahead of issues whenever possible. So before they become these huge things, it's like the elephant mining for conflict questions. Some of these can be used in that manner, but it also solidifies the idea that we're a team, that this is a partnership, and it ultimately gets us to greater buy-in from the employee. And so another way, in addition to having some of these kind of in your back pocket to keep it conversational, is to do some self-reflection and check your active listening, check your empathy skills, avoid interrupting, dismissing, kind of cutting them off. Instead, be careful and make sure that you are actively listening. Dan's doing it right now. He's nodding at me. He's showing me he's engaged in what I'm saying and reflecting back what you're hearing. So what I hear you say is, or it sounds like, ask clarifying questions. We want to make sure that we are keeping the problem in front of us and we are tackling it together as a team. And the only way we can do that is to have a bidirectional feedback dialogue around the problem. And so a couple of tips in Leadr. These are some of my favorite ones. So help future you out, and potentially this might be your one takeaway. Help future you out and go into your one-on-one and create a difficult conversations template of some of these questions that you just saw on the screen. This can help reduce some of the stress or angst around preparing for, how do I even start this conversation? Past you already did it for you. You can go into that template, add as many is helpful to you, and you'll already have some questions there to help guide you. So the other one is to use that care card. If I could scream this from the rooftops, I would. Some people call it a baseball card, but number one, if you are a manager, make sure that your team has filled out their profile, their care card. They've completed those personality assessments, because it is like gold to you as a manager when trying to navigate difficult conversations. You can go in, this is really from Dan's care card. You can go in and see what kind of, how do they like to receive feedback? What does their personality, how do they engage with conflict? How does that land with them? And then again, they can, in the bio, outline some personal insights, different things. It's just really a map, a guidebook for saying, how does your direct report, how does this other person prefer to receive this information? So you're out of the gate, you've got questions, and then you know how to approach this with them in a way that's going to lower that resistance barrier and increase that partnership mindset. So we've got the right goal in mind. We're keeping it timely. We're keeping it relevant. We're beefing up our conversation skills. Dan, what's next?
Yep, we leading right into the next thing is that we want to make, execute, and document a plan. So in the case of maybe me observing you being distracted during a training session, is that something that we need to put together a whole performance improvement plan or a development plan connected to? Probably not, but it's something that we want to pay attention to. But when we look at, okay, hey, all of these things we've talked through and how we want to work towards a solution together, then we want to come up with a plan, and not just one that we chat through, maybe in a Zoom call or in person or on the phone, but something that is actually written down where we can pay attention to it, that we can track progress on it. So it's this idea of, hey, here's a challenge that we have. Here's a way that we want to help you grow and level up. And what we're going to do is we're going to include these time-bound inputs and expectations. So it might be around when you show up to things. It might be around certain inputs or KPIs that you're tracking related to all sorts of things in your role that lead to specific outcomes and impact. So what you're looking at is, here's the work that we need to do that's going to generate the results that we're looking for. Here's another note I would say connected to the baseball card and this plan right here. The plan, the conversation, we'll get some leader tips here in a moment, but how you have that conversation, how you lead your team looks different for every single person. So if I'm leading my team towards a specific goal or a specific solution as a group, the engagement of the individuals on my team, the people on my team are all motivated differently. They all prefer to interact differently, and they all have different things that are easier or harder for them. So knowing how people like to interact is really, really important. Okay, so let's get into this, because sometimes, I don't know, I mean, Courtney, I know you have a kiddo, I have a couple kiddos. Sometimes I say something and it's like, are we good? We understand, everybody's on the same page. Saying something, like what's said and what's heard, are often two very different things. So documenting it is really, really important. A couple quick ways that you can do this inside of the tool are through goals and then through learnings. So let's say in a scenario, we'll pretend like I was the one who is having trouble being engaged in team meetings, and maybe my work was slipping. I wasn't generating the type of results that we had become accustomed to, or those sorts of things. Then we can actually put a development plan in a goal and connect it to specific action items that I am owning and updating you on the progress on. So then that goal and then those learnings that are next to it can be specific things and ways that we're working together to help me to level up, to help me to gain experience or gain ability, or to get feedback around how I'm interacting with others and how they can help me grow. But the tool really connects all of those different pieces, and it provides really brilliant ways for you to document what's happening, so that way you don't get to what often happens or what can sometimes happen. In places I've worked before, and maybe places you've been, or people or customers that you interact with, sometimes what happens is we hear, hey, we love you, we love you, we love you, like, we love you, okay, you're fired, which is really, really confusing, because there was never these ongoing conversations or this written plan around, here's the expectation and here's how we're going to get there. So doing this is actually a great way to engage your team and help to move everybody forward at the same time.
That's so good, Dan. It makes me think of, a lot of times in our leader circles, we talk a lot about all the different components of employee development, right? Goals, feedback, learning, bridging the skill gap, all of these different things. And one of the things that this brings to mind is the performance review process, and that these kinds of plans are how we get to no surprises reviews.
Right.
And that's so important to the way that an employee engages and experiences their workplace. And so, yes, they want this feedback, but they need to know how they're progressing toward it. And if we wait for every quarter, 6 months, a year for them to find out how they're tracking along on their progress towards something that you've had a difficult conversation around, that can be really anxiety inducing and angst filled and just a less effective conversation. And so I love this idea of documenting a really strategic, solid plan. So good.
Yeah, it's my favorite reviews are ones where we get into them. And what I see is what they've written about how we're evaluating our cultural values and outcomes are very similar, if not even some of the same language to what I have written. And for me, that's not a waste of time. What that identifies is, oh, it really was no surprises. There's been ongoing coaching that we've been doing throughout the course of time. And we're just memorializing that conversation now in the review. And we just get to reflect on, hey, here's where we were. And then here's what the focus is for the next 3 months, 6 months, year, whatever it might be. All right. Next step. You ready?
All right, I'm ready. All right, let's see it. Last but not least, step 5, lead by example. Ask for feedback about yourself. This is more of a proactive step, to be honest. It's something you can do after a difficult conversation, to be sure. But once again, it's another one of these regular, consistent habits that suddenly makes these difficult conversations a little less difficult, quite honestly. And so just like mining for conflict, if you are regularly as a leader requesting feedback from your team and modeling what it looks like to receive and respond to sometimes difficult feedback, you're creating that environment of safety and trust that's ultimately going to lead and set you up for future difficult conversations to be more successful. And so your direct reports will have seen what that looks like, and quite honestly, may start to seek it out themselves. And so, as you know, Leadr has a module that's built for this. So this one's kind of it's a nice, easy shot here to draw the line to, but it's so wildly simple to request feedback within the Leadr platform, and you can request it from anyone on your team. And so even, Dan, if you can skip to the next slide,
Yep, you bet.
A little bit of a peek into what that looks like here. This is a actual sample of a feedback request that Dan sent to myself and some of the members of my team. And you can see that little green suitcase button. I love that hidden little sneaky feature that sometimes pops up in some feedback requests. And what that does is it allows Dan, as the requester of feedback, to add that to the next one-on-one with that person. And so not only do you request feedback, but it gives you this nice bridge to talking about that feedback. And so it's this continual ongoing feedback loop that is so, so powerful when it comes to effective development and performance conversations. And so my favorite entry point for requesting feedback as a manager, if you've never done this before, or you're dipping your toe in the feedback culture, high feedback culture waters, is a T3B3, or a top 3, bottom 3. We have a template in Leadr in feedback, and that's what you're seeing a sample of here. This is what Dan requested, and it's really an incredible way to see, one, where you're succeeding. We all like to hear, hey, what are my strengths? What's reading really well to those around me? And then what's not? Where do other people perceive me to be a bit weaker? And I love this because it's holistic feedback, right? It's strengths and weaknesses, but it also can be a little bit more comfortable for those who are giving the feedback to also be able to give some encouragement or positives when you're just starting to test out that new kind of muscle within a working relationship. And so there you have it. 5 simple, right? There's simple steps to mastering difficult conversations. I hope that you've noticed, and you've heard us say this in one way or another throughout this conversation, that this is a skill that takes work and time and practice to build. And also, there are so many variables involved, right? The circumstances, the organization, the culture you're working within, the culture you're attempting to build, the type of person that you're working with, the type of person you are. This is a process, and there's no hard and fast formula. So the more of these muscles and skills you can build, and solutions like Leadr you can utilize, the better you're going to be in the long run. So that's the 5 steps. Dan, any final tips before we head to questions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage, if you have questions, we actually have quite a bit of time that we'll have here at the end. We want to save plenty of time so we could address some real questions and things that you all want to know about. So feel free to drop those into the chat now, and we will address those here in just a moment. 2 things I'll note. 1, you notice that these are the good things that I shared in the feedback request, not the bad ones. So, it was helpful to get some of those. And then the other thing is, yeah, this isn't everything, but I do have some additional tips that I think would be helpful to walk through. So let's look at those. Okay, one of these things is consider the environment. Consider the environment. So this could mean several different things, but often, if I am, let's say it's like casual Fridays and I'm working off the back deck of my porch on a Friday afternoon, and the other person is as well, and I look very comfortable while we're still getting a few things done before we, head into the weekend. Uh, what that communicates about the feedback I'm about to give may not align. So it might feel like, oh, Dan's really relaxed and okay, and it may not communicate, hey, this is a real conversation and something that we need to address. The other thing is, uh, maybe giving somebody, like, having a difficult conversation in a library full of quiet people, that is in front of a whole bunch of other people, may not be the best context. It may not be the best setting. It might be, hey, can we have a real quick conversation? I noticed something. I want to get your perspective and give you some feedback. And you step over to the side or you go to a different room. So just think about the environment and what's happening. And the other thing is, when it comes to considering the environment, I don't know about you, Courtney, but my day is filled with context switching. So in one moment, I'm visiting with a customer and helping them find value and be successful in the tool. In another moment, I'm visiting with somebody who wants to be a customer. In another moment, I'm leading and meeting with my team. In another moment, so there's all these different contexts and situations that I'm in. And for the person where the difficult conversation shows up, and it may not be when I want it, so I just need to be aware of what's happening. So that's there. Another thing might be checking the narrative. I think sometimes when something happens, what we might tend to do, and this is hypothetical, maybe this is just me or one other person you might know, but what we might tend to do is we fill in all the gaps, and we might make it way bigger than it actually is, or we might dismiss something that we actually should pay attention to. And so I think looking at that, I had a friend who used to say, hey, pay attention to what you pay attention to, and really looking for what actually happened, and being open-minded and curious as you engage the conversation could be really, really helpful. We've noted this a little bit throughout, but there's no one size fits all approach. Anytime I've had conversations with people who lead in the human resources space, or anybody who's like a consultant in that space, they say, we bring an example up to them, and the common response is, it depends, right? It depends. And so I think understanding that every situation is unique and that you engage with that exact situation is really, really important. Something else I've made a mistake on in the past and that I've seen is that you can't hold someone accountable to something that isn't defined or communicated. So maybe in our mind, we have this standard, we have this cultural, value that happens, but it's not actually defined. And you're holding people to a standard that you haven't even communicated, or you're assessing them on an outcome that they don't even know is an expectation of their role. And so being able to communicate what does winning look like at the organization, as well as in that specific role, in writing to that person, is really, really essential, because it gives you something to speak back to and to say, hey, a cultural value of ours is blank. I noticed this behavior, which is not aligned with this thing that's here. Can we have a conversation about it? Otherwise, it's all subjective. Okay, two last things. I literally was reading something else right before this that said, feedback, even when not given well, is better than not giving feedback at all. So it's better to engage it and to fumble through it, and be willing to not necessarily do it 100% right, so that you can grow in your ability to do it well. That is going to help you be successful in the long run. And then the last thing is this. We've been talking about having difficult conversations. One of the best ways to be able to have the space and the relational platform to have difficult conversations is to catch people doing things right all of the time. Like if you're consistently communicating and catching people doing things right, then what happens is when you need to have one of these challenging conversations or one of these difficult conversations, it gives you the ability to then say, hey, I have a lot of deposits, so to speak, in our bank account of how I've been recognizing you. And here's something that didn't go quite right. Can we have that? And so you're not operating from a place of, I guess, relational debt or something that isn't helpful there. So those are a couple of thoughts that might be more helpful in, filling out this theme of difficult conversations a little bit more.
I think that's so good, Dan. And it actually addresses one of the questions Angela asked in the chat, I think, which
Yeah.
is, what are your thoughts on the feedback sandwich, positive feedback, constructive, positive feedback? And, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Dan, but in and of itself, right, it's pretty innocuous. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We're trying to make it more palatable, clear that we don't think they do everything poorly and that we do see good things in them. And there's a lot of good intentions behind doing that. But what I think it risks is that, number one, the constructive feedback that we're actually trying to communicate gets lost. Potentially in the feedback sandwich, right? But even greater than that, I actually think it can have we've talked about the theme of trust throughout this conversation. And I think it can actually start to indirectly or unintentionally erode that trust, because I can't quite figure out what I'm supposed to get from this message, right? Am I supposed to hear that I'm doing a good job, or am I supposed to hear that there's somewhere I could improve and grow?
Sure.
And it suggests that constructive feedback is a bad thing that needs to be shrouded in something good that you did. Instead of saying, hey, we have this really healthy, thriving professional relationship that is built on trust and builds bridges. And part of that is honest feedback. And so I don't shy away from giving you direct, honest feedback. And I certainly don't cover it with other positives, right?
Yeah.
And so in and of itself, it's well-intended, but I actually think it speaks to a greater issue, which is that feedback is a bad thing that we need to protect people from. And so to your last point around catching people doing things right, if we're doing that on a consistent basis, then we're kind of set up for a natural, feedback sandwich, because we've told them what they're doing right. They're clear on where they're thriving, where they're winning. And instead we can be really honest and direct where that's maybe not the case. What are your thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, great points. And I want to, let's make sure we talk about, I think we included a slide with a sneak peek here, but we just rolled out something internally that's about to land for everybody. It's called Recognition, which our team is going bananas over. It literally got released late last night, and it's just flooded everybody's, inbox and Leadr and things like that here recently. So it's been super fun. So let's make sure we talk about that. But to your point, I'm a big fan. I don't know if you've heard of the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott, but it's brilliant. I mean, honestly, it is brilliant. And there's this idea in there that we care enough to be candid, that we actually care enough to care personally for the person, but also challenge them directly on something that they might be missing. I would not be who I am today or where I am today if people didn't possess the courage to say the hard things that I needed to hear.
That's it.
I can think of specific examples in my personal life and in my professional life where if people didn't have the guts to engage in a challenging conversation, I frankly, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. And I'm still learning and growing, but I'm so grateful for people who took the risk and said something worth saying. They actually cared enough to be candid with me because it helped me to grow, and I would have been stuck if they hadn't shared it.
Yeah, that's so good. Again, the idea of, we hear a lot, right, Dan, from customers that we want to have a healthy feedback culture, but we also want to make sure we preserve the healthy relationships and the care that we have as a team. And those two things are not in conflict with one another. They actually they're best friends, right? They work together. We can't do one without the other. And so that's so helpful. Thanks, Dan. Hey, do you mind showing us the recognition sneak peek?
Yeah. I'm here. I'm like, yeah, let's keep talking. And then, hey, let's talk about recognition. So literally it's a way to catch people doing things right. It's a way to say, hey, I see you doing this well. And I want to make sure that we recognize you for the incredible work that you're doing. So it just rolled out. It's fantastic. If you don't have it, or if you're interested in it, you should definitely talk to your account manager or your CSM. But what I love about this is it gives us the ability to do so many of those things that we talked about already in our conversation today, and sets up the conversations for on the back end. So that's recognition.
So helpful. Like Dan said, it just launched, and our team is already just so excited and blowing up the recognition feed. So it's been really fun. But hey, another question, Dan, while we're at it, that just popped into the chat, I think it's worth addressing, is how do we handle when there's an employee doing the job, but they're not really engaged, like their heart's not in it? How do you have that conversation?
Yeah, so fantastic question. So we have you have somebody who maybe just not that their heart isn't in it, but they might actually hit the expectations of the job. So they like hit the outcomes that they need to, but nobody really enjoys working with them. That could be another variation of this. So I think any sort of expectation around what does the role look like and how do you address those things is one, to say, hey, here's what I'm observing. I'd love to get some feedback. And two, if somebody's doing the job, but it feels like they're just not as excited about or engaged in the role anymore, then have a conversation about it. Because it might be something like, well, I just don't find the work challenging anymore. Okay, well then how can we help provide a plan for you to level up and grow into this area, or to move to leading a team, or to move to the next level of blank, to engage in a different conversation that might reignite some of the passion they have for what the role is. I was visiting with somebody else on our team actually today, and I was referencing back to Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if you've ever read that or not, but in that book, he says there's three things that are needed for someone to enjoy their work. And those things are that we want to have autonomy, that it needs to be like complex and challenging, and that we want to see a direct connection between our effort and reward. So those are a bit vague, but in that scenario, what I would engage them with is, hey, I'm observing that you're crushing the role, but it seems like maybe you're not as excited about the work that you do, or that you don't carry the same level of passion that you were for this role. Am I wrong, or am I misunderstanding something? Like, be willing to say, hey, it's probably me, not you. So that's what I would say. I would just be curious about it. I would draw attention to it, and then I'd go after it.
I love it. That's so good. And something I think is really helpful is, again, this is about preparation on your part as the leader, is to do your best to take that feeling or that maybe hunch you have that their heart is not in it, or that they're disengaged, and try to, in essence, quantify that as a behavior, and see what evidence you have to support that. Because number one, that's way less off-putting or likely to generate a defensive response in the recipient. When you say, hey, I watched you do this thing, what that leads me to potentially believe is this. That leads me to potentially believe you are disengaged, or your heart's maybe not here. Tell me more about that. What may have been behind that? And so that idea of figuring out how can we make this really concrete and behavioral, and less about our assumptions or reads as the leader, is a really important step there. So great question. Well, hey, a couple of questions that people submitted who had registered ahead of time and wanted to make sure that we got. I'm going to throw one to you here, Dan. How long do you wait to have a difficult conversation? Is it like one mistake and we're talking about it? Is it 2, 5? When are we doing it?
Yeah. So I'll point you back to something I said earlier, which is it depends. But a lot of that depends on like how egregious was the mistake, right? If it's a smaller thing that you can address just quickly in a conversation, great, then let's do it. But if it's something, it's like, hey, this is a really big deal, and in fact it's a fireable offense, we need to have a conversation right now, and you need to know how extreme or how serious this conversation is. Like, there's a bit of those things. What I will say is, when you are proactive in addressing some of the smaller things, some of those maybe first straws that you see related to how somebody does, then it'll lead to healthier conversations on the other end. As a leader, as a person, for myself, here's what I know: I get what I tolerate. And so if I'm not willing to engage in such a way that communicates, hey, I care about you being successful here, and I care about who you're becoming while you're here, but also I care about what you're doing. And if you can have that conversation and have it in a way over a small thing first, then it makes maybe potentially harder conversations in the future easier to have. So I know that's it's like, maybe we can talk. I don't know who submitted the question, but hey, here's a specific question. Maybe we can talk about it. But it depends, and address it early, and respond with the level of severity that it warrants. Might be the way to summarize that.
Yeah, we get what we tolerate, I think, is a great test for, do I need to have this conversation? And so that if the answer is we get what we tolerate, do I want to get this on an
Yeah,
ongoing basis, right?
sure.
And again, if we are consistently mining for conflict, consistently requesting feedback as leadership, asking those conversational starter questions in one-on-ones and in non-difficult conversations, then everything doesn't have to be a huge, massive, difficult conversation. It can be a small thing we've addressed. And if over time we're seeing the pattern emerge, then
Mhm.
that becomes the really pointed, direct, difficult conversation. And so as we're making this a regular rhythm of giving feedback, shooting elephants, if you will, suddenly these become much more manageable, and we get to determine what we want to get because it's what we tolerate. So that's so good.
Good questions. What else we got out there? What
I
other
was going to
questions?
say, keep throwing questions in the chat that you have. We've still got about 10 minutes, so here to help however we can. There was one that came through, Dan, and I thought this was a really great question, which is, we've given feedback to a team member and they did not receive it well. So they start becoming distant, disengaged, stop communicating. Now what?
Yeah, it happens, right? So that's the thing. People are really complex, and there's all sorts of things that happen. And what having a difficult conversation can feel like is, I'm in trouble. And a natural response to I'm in trouble is, I'm going to run, I'm going to isolate, I'm going to withdraw. And we all respond to conflict in different ways. And I think what we can do as leaders, or the ones who had the difficult conversation, is if they do that after the conversation, then we can go first. And what that might look like is, hey, Courtney, I just want to check in with you. I know that we had a challenging conversation yesterday, and I wanted to follow back up with you to see how you're processing that, and see if there's any other questions or concerns that might be connected to it that'd be worth having a conversation about.
Yeah, it's another difficult conversation, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it becomes part of our rhythms. And so unfortunately, that's really the answer is, well, it sounds like you have another difficult conversation, but sometimes it can be helpful to frame, even if it's later when we're like, uh-oh, they've disengaged, they're withdrawing, this obviously did not land the way I hoped it would land, is to give them some really pragmatic, practical context. Some of the things we've talked about here is, hey, I'm really passionate about building a relationship that breeds trust and honesty and candor between you and I. And so I wanted to share that feedback with you. I'm noticing these behaviors, and it feels like perhaps that didn't land the way I had hoped it would land. And so what have you been feeling lately? Give them a chance to share more about how they experienced that conversation, and then you can coach from there. And again, it may be a really direct conversation. Hey, I hear that was hard. That was a really challenging piece of feedback for you to receive. And we still need to see some change. And here's what that change could look like. And documenting a plan, right? And so we can go kind of oscillate between the 5 steps we outlined today, and make sure that we're just rerunning those steps every time we need to. And once again, those conversations will become more and more natural. Well, more question that came through, Dan, and it's, I struggle with frank feedback. I've never committed to having hard but necessary conversations with my team. How do I get started after years of not having them without it feeling like a sudden jolt or really aggressive to them?
Yeah, fantastic question. One, I don't know who submitted that question, but good for you. Just the desire to engage in that sort of conversation is so brave and hard. And so I just want to say, well done. I appreciate that you're even thinking about it and looking for a way to engage, because it's hard, but it's worth it. What I would say to that response is something that you noted in the previous question we were just talking about. I think expressing intent is really helpful. So in this scenario, maybe how that could look is, hey team, you may have noticed that I don't really enjoy conflict, and that sometimes all I tell you are nice things or things that you're doing well. What I've noticed is that can be a challenge for my own growth and also for your growth. And I don't want to rob you of that. And so what I'm going to work on is being intentional and sharing challenges or having conversations that maybe I wouldn't have had before, because I'm committed to growing and I'm committed to your growth. And so that might be awkward. There's a very good chance I'm not going to do it well the first time. But I just wanted to let you know that that is my intent. And so if you feel like there's a shift in how we interact, it's because I care enough about who you're becoming and what we're doing to do something about it. So if you could give me feedback on how that's going and compassion and grace in the moment, I think we can all grow together. Does that sound okay?
Being a leader is so hard, Dan. There's so much vulnerability and courage that it takes to make some of these shifts, especially things like conflict or feedback or difficult conversations. But it goes back to the step of leading by example. And we said, ask for feedback first, right? But this would apply as well. Hey, I know about a weakness. I know something that I should be doing
Yeah.
to help develop this team, to lead this team, to lead you well, and I'm not doing it. And so I'm willing to own that and to model what it looks like to walk that shaky road a little bit, kind of going first. And so that's so good. Well, hey, everyone, thank you again for joining us for the first installment of Manager 101, this one talking about mastering difficult conversations. We truly do hope it was helpful to you. As we're wrapping up, I hope that you were able to grab that one thing, that one practical action item or step you're going to take this week to move you closer toward mastering difficult conversations. And so if you could you drop that in the chat so that we can be cheering you on? Some of your customer success team is part of this webinar today, and they're looking there to cheer you on. They're your strategic partners, and they are in your corner. A couple of final FYIs or housekeeping pieces is that if you have ongoing questions or you want to continue to have this coaching conversation around difficult conversations, your customer success manager is ready and willing to set that up with you. So please reach out to them. They also have been equipped with a full list of some learnings, some videos, some content, some resourcing that can continue to help you to level up and equip you for these conversations even more. So please reach out to them. They'd love to share that with you. After today's webinar, you will be getting an email that has the recording. So my encouragement to you is share this with someone else on your team who would love to sharpen their difficult conversation skills. But you'll also get a PDF download of some conversation cards that are role play prompts so that you and other managers on your team can begin to practice these conversations, kind of like Dan and I just did in the webinar. And so we hope those are helpful to you. We've had a lot of great feedback around our conversation cards. And so we hope these are kind of like a supplement to those, some role play prompts for you. So we hope that's helpful, but excited to read those takeaways. Thank you so much for your time today, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks, everyone.